So let's go ahead and let's start today. So today I actually have two books that I just want to briefly talk about. I love to read. Reading is one of my favorite things. And I bought this book in New York about 3 years ago in 2017. And it's called On Tyranny. And I think it's a very relevant book for what's going on right now. 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. It's a short little book. It's maybe 119 pages, not long at all, but it's a really, really great read for today's time. Now, the second book is a really exciting book. It's a bit of an Easter egg, in fact, and it's called The Third Wave by Alvin Toffler. Now, I had no idea about this book when we first started The Third Wave about 5 years ago, but we had a reader reach out and was like, hey, Paul, it's so interesting that you've decided to call this The Third Wave of Psychedelics. There was this book, The Third Wave, written by Alvin Toffler in 1980. Now, Alvin Toffler was a well-known futurist. He was the editor-in-chief, if I remember correctly, of Fortune magazine and wrote 3 books about the future, one of which was The Third Wave. Now, in The Third Wave, Alvin Toffler talks about how the first wave was the agricultural age, the second wave was the industrial age, and the third wave is the information age. It's this decentralized way of connecting all of our various nodes that help to sort of not overthrow, but help us to evolve out of nation-state capitalism as we know it into a way that is much more abundant. Because of the internet, because of the invention of the semiconductor chip, because of now the smartphone, and really all of this technology was infused through the psychedelic experience in the 60s, we now have this opportunity to connect with others in ways that we never have before. And so what we're experiencing right now amidst COVID-19 and amidst the protests is a time of great unknown, because all of this energy that has been built up over the last 500 years of the industrial era is now fully giving way to the information age. You know, what happened with the internet and the invention of the internet in the 90s is comparable to the printing press, and how the printing press inspired the great renaissance of all these great, European Enlightenment. We're seeing a similar thing now with the internet. And we're going through this really interesting phase right now where we're still trying to adapt and adjust to this new way of living. But that, I think, is one of the great hopes of reintegrating psychedelics, both microdosing and higher doses, is to help us adapt to this new way of being. Okay, so there's a lot there. I want to take a step back and acknowledge a few things before we fully dive into the content of our webinar today. One is the recent protests that we've been experiencing on the back of COVID-19. You know, when we first started to promote this webinar, we had the initial email subject line, which was the elephant in the room. And we just talked about in that subject line COVID-19. The reason for that was because I happened to be on vacation at that point, and we didn't adapt and adjust it in time to be fully present to the situation going on. So for the beginning of today's webinar, I want to fully acknowledge what has been happening with the protests. And I want to talk about 2 things in particular as it relates to the intentional use of psychedelics and the sort of civil rights movement that we're currently experiencing. One is that psychedelic use opens us up to new possibilities. And oftentimes, what psychedelic use helps us to understand is the interdependencies of everything, of all energy, and how interconnected we are to everything around us. That's not only our families and loved ones, but that's our wider communities, and that is the global population at large. So really, when it comes to the freedom and liberation of in particular, African Americans, and what's happening with systemic racism, that is directly tied to our own freedoms as well, and my own freedom as well. So I think one of the main things from this is how we can continue to utilize our privilege and our position to help ensure that all beings become more free and liberated over time. The second thing is a bit more practical. There's a fantastic book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander that was written in 2008, which details how the war on drugs is just the next iteration of systemic racism in the United States. So initially, when we started the third wave in 2015, it was specifically to normalize psychedelic use. And that was because After cannabis, psychedelics were the most reasonable illicit drug to not only medicalize, but actually decriminalize to help end the drug war. Because although making psychedelics medically available to treat PTSD and addiction and depression is so important, it is equally important that we stop incarcerating people immediately for any and all drug use. Whether those drugs are legal or illegal, there's really no difference. There is no sane way to criminalize drug users. And that's why it's so important that we continue to normalize psychedelic substances so that we can help to fully end the drug war. That, I think, should be one of the highest, if not the highest priority of the psychedelic renaissance, this third wave of psychedelics. So I think that is enough there. What we'd love to do is just dive into now a couple questions before we really get going with the rest of the webinar. If you could queue up the first question. So the first question is going to be, have you tried microdosing before? So we just want to get a lay of the land. We want to get a sense for, how much experience people have when coming into this webinar. So if you could just click yes or no, that will help us to better understand who we're speaking to.
Hovering around 70%.
Which way?
Yes.
So about 70% of you have tried microdosing before, about 30% of you have not. And if we could go into the next question as well, about whether or not you've benefited from a microdosing experience. That poll is live now. So was your microdosing experience beneficial? Yes, no, or was it just so-so? You didn't really notice any effects either way.
75% positive, around 20% so-so.
So about 75% positive, which is great, and about 20% so-so. So the first distinction that I love to make when talking about microdosing that I think is so necessary is that microdosing is not just taking a stem and a cap of a mushroom or 10 micrograms of LSD once. It's really best to think of microdosing as a routine, as a ritual, as something we do over 4 to 6 to 8 weeks with support and guidance and a specific intention. Because the beautiful thing about microdosing is that it can really help to make us more open and adaptable to change. And neuroplasticity, this concept of neuroplasticity, which we'll dive into in the health and immunity section, can be both good and potentially bad. And that's why it's so critical that set and setting is paid attention to, both for microdosing and high doses of psychedelics. So before we go any further, let's go a little bit into the basics of microdosing. If you could pull up the presentation. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Good. So before we dive into the basics, an overview of what we will cover in this webinar today: COVID, protest, and chaos. Only one more thing I'll say about that. The sort of main idea that I want you to hold on to throughout this webinar is how can you differentiate your signal, your truth, your inner landscape from all the external chaos that is going on. There's so much noise right now. And it's important now more than ever that we really attune to our own signal, our own intuition to guide us along the path that we have deemed to be best for us. So that's sort of how I want you to think about this webinar: is signal versus the noise. What is your signal versus all the noise that is going on in the world today? The second thing that we're going to cover are some basics around microdosing, just sort of as a warm-up for the rest of the webinar. The third thing then we'll dive into is health and immunity. So what role can microdosing play in helping us to become more healthy, in helping us to develop a better immune system, especially as it relates to viruses and COVID. Next one. The fourth one is intention, ritual, and ceremony. The fifth one is coaching and community. So we're going to talk about what's the role of accountability, what's the role of structure. This isn't just a bunch of nasal gazing that we want to go into, but we really, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we are interdependent beings. Our well-being is directly connected to the well-being of those around us. We'll then talk about the new program that Third Wave will be offering, Microdosing Experience program, and then we'll get into some Q&A at the very end. So without further ado, let's go into the microdosing basics. So first of all, what is microdosing? Microdosing is consuming a sub-perceptible amount of psychedelics with a kind of over a consistent period of time with a specific intention. And ideally that intention is related to two things. It's either related to emotional well-being, or it's related to maybe creativity or leadership. So we're really looking at two main things when it comes to microdosing. One is becoming whole, going from dysfunctional to functional. So having a clinical issue like PTSD, depression, addiction, how can we heal that to get back to baseline? And then once we're at baseline, how do we then elevate? So how do we go from functional to optimal using microdosing? And those are the two main ways that people look at how they're using microdosing. So then when it comes to specifically microdosing, like what are some of the particulars? Dr. Jim Fadiman was and is the godfather of microdosing. He popularized a protocol of microdosing 2 times per week for a period of about 5 weeks. So you microdose on day 1, you take day 2 and day 3 off, keep the slide. You microdose on day 4, you take day 5 and day 6 off, and then you repeat that cycle 5 times. Now, when people microdose with LSD, they typically start at about 5 to 6 micrograms and might go up to 20 micrograms. If people microdose with psilocybin mushrooms, they usually start at 0.1 and then eventually incrementally increase to 0.5 grams. And that's very high, so be mindful of that. And what we always encourage people to do is to start low and go slow. You know, the only really negative experiences that people have when microdosing is taking too much and then maybe being, you know, on a work day or having some sort of other commitment. It's really critical that the first few times that you microdose, you start low and go slow. Start at 5 micrograms of LSD or 0.1 grams of mushrooms, and then you can slowly calibrate from that point forward. So what are some of the benefits that people experience from microdosing? So there are a wide range of benefits that people experience. It's important to emphasize that clinical research is still in its infancy for microdosing. So many of these reported benefits are either from anecdotal reports or from survey-based research that has been done over the past few years. So some of them include elevated mood, increased energy, more creativity, able to better sort of regulate emotions, more consistent meditation practice. Really, the comparison that I love to make when it comes to microdosing is mindfulness meditation. So just like when we consistently meditate, and it's so crazy, I used to meditate, I've been meditating for 10 years, but I took like the last few years on and off, and I started meditating again these last few days, and I remembered how important meditation is as a practice, how grounding it is, how, especially with all the chaos going on right now, we have all this rumination and how it can just quiet the mind and allow us to sink in and be silent and learn stillness. Stillness is critical now more than ever, becoming aware of how empty things around us really are. So that's the comparison that I like to make when it comes to microdosing. It's like mindfulness meditation. So a lot of the same benefits that people report from a microdosing protocol can also be found with meditation. Now, of course, there are some major differences. One is that microdosing is exogenous. It comes from an external source, whereas meditation is endogenous. It comes from within. So a lot of people who have a hard time starting a meditation practice or sticking consistently to a meditation practice will often integrate microdosing to help solidify that meditation practice over the mid to long term. Okay, so far we've reviewed COVID, signal versus the noise, what are the basics of microdosing and how can those help us to better differentiate our signal from the noise. So now I want to go into health and immunity. And this is a very personal thing. So I encourage you to think about this from your own perspective and your own point of view. This is about you, your health, and your immunity. How can a microdosing practice help you cultivate greater resilience, specifically to things like COVID-19, especially as it looks like the vaccine, it might work, it might not work. There's so many unknowns. What we can control is our own well-being. What we can control is how we take care of ourselves. And so the first thing to be aware of when it comes to microdosing is its impact on neuroplasticity. So microdoses of psilocybin mushrooms and LSD affect something called the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of many serotonin receptors. And we've tied the activation of that serotonin receptor to the development of more gray matter in the brain and to basically more adaptability. It's easier to learn things. And that's because that 5-HT2A receptor does a few interesting things in the prefrontal cortex, which is tied to our executive functions, learning, intelligence, things like that. So the first thing to be mindful of is the relationship. Can you please stay on me?
Okay.
For now? Yeah. So the first thing to be mindful of is the relationship between microdosing and neuroplasticity. So if microdosing can help you to better adapt, then that means that you can start to make more informed decisions about how you treat yourself. So then how does that relate to the next point? Parasympathetic versus sympathetic. So the sympathetic system is our fight or flight response. It's when cortisol is very high, when stress levels are very high, when anxiety is quite high, and we get stuck in this reactive position. This is when rumination is just going on, when we can't sleep well, when we feel burnt out and tired. That's us stuck in a sympathetic perspective. And when we're stuck in a sympathetic perspective, we have brain fog, our bodies are more inflamed, our guts are more inflamed, our brains are more inflamed, and it's just generally harder to respond with compassion, with patience, and with love for the things that are happening around us. Whereas the parasympathetic state is the rested and regulated state, the rest and digest state. It's when we feel grounded, it's when we feel centered, and it's when we feel balanced, so that we can respond to the chaos that is going on and not just feel like we're overwhelmed, there's way too much, what is happening? Now, why is that so important? And what's the relationship between microdosing and neuroplasticity and parasympathetic versus sympathetic? Well, let's zoom out a little bit. So when we look at high doses of psychedelics or peak experiences, those can often puncture the sort of concrete wall that the sympathetic system has in us. Because when we're stuck in a sympathetic way of being, it can be really hard to get out of that. We often have to take a week off. We have to go to the woods for a while. We have to just totally do a reset. So when it comes to that puncture, right? Psychedelics, especially a high dose, allows us to create a ceremony, a ritual, an intention that allows us to really take a step back, have a 50,000-foot view perspective on our life, and then from that sort of observer mindset, we can then, with intention and responsibility, choose, okay, I'd like to keep these things around. I think these things nourish me, or I need to create a boundary here. I need to maybe not engage with this person because they're toxic, or maybe I need to stop smoking cigarettes because they're really, it's a big risk in the COVID era, or maybe it's, I need to be more mindful of my meditation practice or my breathwork practice. So when we puncture that sympathetic mode, it allows us to have that perspective, so that way we can start to make very informed decisions about how we want to live our life. This is what I call setting your new North Star, setting that new compass. And in fact, in our program that we will announce at the end of today's webinar, this is why we're integrating a breakthrough breathwork ceremony as part of it. Because we want to give you the tools to have that zooming out and have that perspective. And then it will be followed by 4 weeks of integration coaching with microdosing. Because once you puncture that sympathetic system and you're able to have that perspective, setting that new North Star, then microdosing is sort of a lubricant, right? It's a way to continue to help you to stay present and adaptable. So that way, if you have the view of, I really think quitting cigarettes is best for me, or I really think I need to stop, being in a relationship with this person, or, I really feel like, starting a consistent meditation practice is going to help me to deal with anxiety or depression or whatever it might be. Then microdosing over a consistent period of time, for the 4 weeks of integration will help that sort of vision be grounded into reality. Because what we are all about here is agency. I've been asking a question lately of friends of mine, which is, if choice is your superpower, how do you choose to be free? Right? So if choice is your superpower, how do you choose a life of freedom, a path of freedom? All of us are encumbered. All of us are dealing with things that restrict us, that don't feel great, that just, that's just part of living in this dualistic framework, in this dualistic world. So it's important that we keep this purity of action in terms of what, as beings, will help us to become more and more free. Because as we free ourselves, we also free our loved ones, we also free our friends, we also free our wider communities. And this is what we're all about. It's about freedom and it's about liberation. Okay, next slide. Great. So this leads us into intention, ritual, and ceremony. And I'm just going to pull up my notes real quick, as much as I believe, and I would love to do this all off the top of my head. Okay. Intention, ritual, and ceremony. So we've already talked about signal versus the noise. And we've talked about how a high dose psychedelic use can puncture that sympathetic state, can help us to reacquaint ourselves with our signal, to shut off the noise, to create boundaries from that noise so our signal can grow bigger and stronger and just more free and beautiful. So how do we then integrate that on an ongoing basis? That's where intention, ritual, and ceremony comes in. So when we look at intention, when we look at setting our new North Star, that's really about focalizing our energy, right? That's saying, okay, all these things are going on. I have these dreams, I have these issues, I have these bills to pay. How can I find peace and stillness to tune into what intention, what is the one intention that will help me to become more free? What is the one intention that will help me to quit smoking? What is the one intention that will help me to meditate more consistently? What is the one intention that will help me to put my phone away in the morning and not be distracted by it? And how can we hold that intention on a consistent basis? Now, it's usually best to have a simple meditation, a simple intention, a simple mantra that we consistently go back to. So that's the first step. Right? How can we tie that intention to spending more time in a parasympathetic state, in a rested and digested state? That's one thing to think about. Then, once we've given more thought to that intention, how can we ritualize that intention? How can we actually start to integrate that on a consistent basis throughout our routines? I'll give you an example. I'm 29 now. So for most of my 20s, I haven't had any sort of coach or personal coach. I've just sort of gone at it alone. I've had mentors, I've had friends, I've had incredible business partners. So I've had a lot of mirroring that's been very helpful, but I haven't had someone that's been in my corner to keep me accountable for the dreams and the visions that I want to follow through on. But over the past few months, I brought in a coach. And one of the first things that he had me do is he had me, because I struggle a little bit with time management, I tend to be more of the surfing type. He helped me to basically get everything in my calendar from 7 a.m. when I woke up till 10:30 p.m. when I went to bed at night. So I would have breath work in there. I would have my creative block in there. I would, have lunch. I would have my training period. I would have, calls that I would need to do for people. Everything was set aside in that calendar. So as part of our coaching, we worked on certain intentions, right? Like, what are the new habits that I want to integrate to support a greater sense of well-being, to support more peace and stillness in my own life? And then essentially what he had me do is, okay, if you want to do that, if you think it's an important ritual, then put it on your calendar and do it every day. And I only had one thing that I had to do with that calendar. One thing. It's okay if I missed times. It's okay if I wasn't totally, like if I started breath work at 8:30 instead of 8, that was totally fine. The only thing that I had to do was, after the fact, if I didn't fully honor the integrity of that calendar, was just to go back and change it. So if I started breath work at 8:30, at the end of the day, I would just go back and change that in my calendar. So at the end of the week, I could see, oh, these were the actual rituals that I honored. These were the actual ways that I infused that intention into my day-to-day so it could actually come to life. And it wasn't just something that I kept dreaming about, oh, it would be nice to do this one day or nice to do that one day, but it became concrete, became real. And why? Because I chose that. And I wanted it. It was desire of mine. And I knew that it would serve the greater purpose of who I am. So the encouragement sort of for the end of this section is, when it comes to microdosing, how can you set an intention that encourages you to spend more time in a parasympathetic state, establishing appropriate boundaries? And then once you have that clear idea, that new North Star, how can you actually ritualize those new routines so they become part of your day-to-day, week-to-week, and month-to-month habits? So you can incrementally start to see changes over time. Because this isn't just about microdosing being a magic pill. This isn't just about taking a psychedelic and thinking it's going to fix your issues. This is about doing the work of turning inwards, of understanding your shadow, of going into your shadow, and then better integrating it so that you can turn out and show up as a healthier, more sort of present mirror for other people in this time of a lot of unknown and chaos. Let's go to the final part of this presentation, which would be container, coaching, and community. What is a container? So there's a phrase that's often used in the psychedelic space, set and setting, which has to do with your mindset going into an experience and the setting, the context, the environment in which you are having the experience. So I think that's a really good basic framework of thinking about your container. What's your home life like? How clean is it? Do you surround yourself with things that you love? What about your partner or spouse or loved one? Is it someone that you really love and that you want to be with? What about your friends or these people that you want to be spending time with? How about the food that you eat? That's part of your container. The exercise that you do, the meditation habits that you have, the place that you've chosen to live, the neighborhood that you choose to live in, the geographical location that you've chosen to live in, right? All of these things are part of our container. And for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, we predominantly choose the container in which we want to live. Sometimes that's not consciously. Sometimes we choose that subconsciously or unconsciously from trauma, from past stories, from things that we continue to drag with us, this baggage with us. But this is part of the beauty of psychedelic substances, of doing things like breath work, of, like having high dose experiences, of going through with microdosing, is they help us to shed. They help us to eliminate. They help us to simplify. When we think about the container in which we want things to exist, we want it to be in a way that really supports and nourishes our full well-being. So again, just as a personal example, the things that I feel like I've chosen from a container perspective are when COVID happened in mid-March. I was living in Oakland at the time. I had done some preliminary research on the effect that UV radiation would have on viruses, and I assumed because Miami was a much sunnier place than many that the virus would be less contagious here. And we also know that vitamin D helps with immunity. So as part of my container for these last few months, my container for the COVID chrysalis, if you will, I chose to live in Miami. And I was happy about that choice. And I have been very happy about that choice. Another thing that I've chosen to do is to meditate more consistently. As I mentioned earlier, I've just recently started a meditation practice, and I'm choosing to make that as part of my container. But of course, nothing's perfect. I still have issues. I still have problems. One thing that I've struggled with over COVID and really for most of my 20s has been cannabis use. I still find that I numb emotionally myself through cannabis use. I still find that when I'm stressed or anxious or maybe spending more time in a sympathetic state, that I tend to numb that with cannabis. Sometimes that's a tincture, which is the better, but sometimes I smoke spliffs with tobacco. That's a less than ideal part of my container. In fact, in my next high-dose psychedelic experience, my next breakthrough ceremony, which we will go through in the Microdosing Experience program, the intention for me is to understand why is it that cannabis is so sticky for me? Why is it that it continues to come up again and again? And what can I do to create a boundary around my own sense of well-being so it doesn't keep finding its way into my hearth and home and my soul? So what's your container? What are the parts of your container that you love, that nourish you, that bring you peace and stillness and well-being? And what are the parts of your container that don't nourish you, that create friction, that create resistance, that create negative patterns, or maybe, stories that aren't so loving? And how can microdosing and general psychedelic use help you to address those patterns and help you to root those out and heal those so that when you set that new North Star, you feel like, I'm supported in this? Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the process of inner healing, the process of going inwards, it's not just nasal gazing. I keep messing that up. It's not just nasal gazing. Remember, if you choose to be free, if choice is your superpower, what do you choose? And as part of that, it's not just our own freedom, but it's the freedom of all being. It's the freedom of everything around us, because we are interconnected to everything around us. Our well-being and our freedom is interdependent on everything. And that's why it's so important that when you go through with a microdosing experience, that you do it within a container that supports you, that you do it within a container of expertise, that you do it with coaches that will help you, guide you on that process, with other people who have the intention and who want to do this in a responsible way. I can't tell you how many times I hear about people who are microdosing, even friends of mine. Like I had a friend of mine a month or two ago who just sent me this photo on Instagram or whatever with like a handful of mushrooms. He's like, is this a microdose? And I'm like, no, dude, that's way more than a microdose, right? So there's still so much that people aren't doing well when it comes to microdosing. And that's in a way a huge risk, because microdosing is illegal in most places, right? Getting LSD or psilocybin mushrooms is a risk. And if you're going to put your neck on the line, if you're going to put your skin in the game so you can really take agency back and take control back and find your own freedom, then you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that is useful, that is effective, that has been proven to work time and time again. That container, that accountability for your own process, there is nothing more critical than that. Because once you've determined your signal, once you've attuned to that and cut out the chaos, once you've established boundaries to honor that signal, to honor you spending more time in a parasympathetic state, you've ritualized that, you've integrated it from an intention perspective into your day-to-day. Then the final step is your container. The final step is the people that you choose to surround yourself with as you go through this experience to feel like you're supported and loved in the process. And unfortunately, psychedelics are still illegal. Unfortunately, psychedelics are still in many ways very stigmatized. Granted, there has been, especially over the last year or two, a complete resurgence of interest. But for the most part, most people still aren't totally turned on to the potential of psychedelics, to the benefit of psychedelics, to how low risk psychedelics really are if there's a great set and setting and container for the experience. Be very mindful of who you choose to microdose with. Be very mindful of the support that you seek out. That's why we've been doing this work from the get-go. That's why I started Third Wave. That's why we rolled out our microdosing course, which over 3,000 people have now enrolled in. That's why we've talked to people at business and tech conferences. That's why we've done tons of research on microdosing, because we are trying to understand what is the optimal way to microdose. If you're going to put your neck on the line, if you're going to put skin in the game and risk something to do this, you want to make sure that it works. You want to make sure that it's effective and that it actually has an impact on your well-being, that it's not just another distraction, that it's not just, oh, like, we'll see if it works, but that you really commit to it and that you really tell yourself, now is the time. When our external world is falling apart, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we're transitioning from the second wave to the third wave, not just of psychedelics, but of civilization, of culture at large, right? How can these tools be used to help us adapt? How can microdosing be used to help us adapt to all the unknown and chaos? Just a couple more things I want to share that I think are super important and relevant. I don't get a chance to interact a lot with our community. And I'm so grateful that all of you have been with us. Some of you are new. Some of you have probably been with us since the very beginning. The Third Wave as an organization has seen a lot of ups and downs. I myself as an individual have gone through a lot of ups and downs. And although I'm optimistic, and although I generally try to exude a positive light of these substances are becoming more normal, these substances are becoming decriminalized and medicalized, it would also be not fair of me to express my fears. And I think one of the fears that I have right now is that things will get worse before they get better. That we've now seen COVID and the lockdowns. We are now experiencing massive protests and civil unrest. In the United States, we're going into election cycle very soon, which always brings up a ton of stuff. And this will be probably the most intense of any election cycle in the past. The world as we know it does not exist any longer. And we, in many ways, are boldly stepping in to create and build a new way of being that is rooted in the wisdom of these plant medicines that have been with us for thousands and thousands of years. And so there is nothing more courageous that you can do, and that I can do, and that we can do at this point in time than to go inwards, to explore the parts of ourselves that are not healed, to explore the parts of ourselves that have been cut off or neglected or traumatized, and to have the courage to face ourselves. Because in facing ourselves truly and fully, in the dynamism of everything that we are, from the darkest, deepest, nastiest thing that is within all of us, to the most beautiful, awe-inspiring elements, we can only understand the chaos that is going on around us, and that will only continue to get worse if we become fully familiar with the range of chaos inside of us. Because what psychedelics do is they throw you deep into the unknown, and they throw you oftentimes into the unknown with barely an anchor or a mooring. And it's critical that you go off and search these sort of inner antipodes of your mind. Because through that process of self-discovery, through that process of swimming in the undercurrent, that's when you develop the resilience. That's when you develop the adaptability. That's when you develop, simply put, the courage to not hide, to not cower, but to go out into this world of chaos and unknown, of fear. There are so many people in fear. And to embody a regulated state, to embody a state of peace, to embody a state of stillness, to embody love and compassion for everyone around you. Because as things grow more divisive, and they will only get more divisive, it will be critical for those of us who have been doing work with psychedelic substances to honor the middle way, to find the integration of those poles, to balance them both within ourselves and within the work that we choose to pursue, and then to bring that energy out into the world, an integrated, embodied, and balanced energy. And psychedelics as medicine can help us do that. Last slide before we go into our new program that we're offering. This is like an African proverb. It's kind of interesting. We're not very cliche, but this is somewhat of a cliche. If you want to go if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. This is a path that is long and arduous. This is a path that for many of us has only just started. This isn't about getting to a destination right away, because there is no destination to get to. But this is about recharging and rebuilding and bringing things fully into the light to be seen, so that we can honor and acknowledge where we all are in our own individual and collective process. So with that being said, throughout this webinar, we talked about COVID, we talked about signal versus the noise, we've gone over the basics of microdosing, we've discussed health and immunity and how puncturing that sympathetic state with a breakthrough experience and integrating with microdosing can help us to ritualize that intention into our everyday being. And then we talked about the importance of container, coaching, and community throughout that process. So over the past few years, we've had a microdosing course. Over 3,000 people have enrolled into that microdosing course. We've also offered a little bit of one-on-one coaching, a 30-minute consulting call here and there. We've done a little bit of a prep experience integration coaching program. But today's program is really the first comprehensive group coaching program. And the reason we're offering this is for all the reasons that we already outlined in this webinar. It's partly microdosing and the breakthrough to help you understand and do that in a really responsible way. It's partly to help you clarify your intention, to clarify what new rituals and routines that you want to integrate in your way of being. And it's also to provide that container, to provide that community, to provide that coaching support, so that you're not doing this alone, but that you're doing this with other, can you please keep that up? But that you're doing this with other people as you go through the process of your microdosing experience. Please keep it up. So the program begins on June 28th. That's 2 weeks from today. Our registration closes on June 21st. It is limited to 50 participants. So there are over 500 people. How many people are in the webinar around that? 450. So there are about 450 people in this webinar. It's limited to 50 participants. There are over 30,000 people on our email list and 80,000 people on our social media. We expect this to sell out fast, to say the least. It comes with 6 group coaching sessions, which will be done every Sunday at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. We will have 2 different sessions, and that way, if you're in Australia or Europe, depending on your time zone, you can pick either 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays. All of those sessions will be led by myself and a couple guest instructors, including 1 medical doctor and 1 executive coach. We will announce those with more details later on. Week 1 will be about clarifying your purpose. Week 2 will be about eliminating distractions. Week 3 is about setting your new North Star. Week 4 is about vulnerability and accountability. Week 5 is about Week 5 is about, setting your intention, something like that. Or no, integration. It's the other I. Week 5 is about integration. And then week 6 is about sustainability. How can you go forward with these new rituals as part of who you are? It also comes with private community support. So you'll be in a private community. We'll have IG Lives, and we'll have a Slack group available to make sure that you're supported throughout that entire process. We're also doing a breathwork ceremony that will be announced as well. We've been talking with Sonic Shamanic and Leo Ratterman to bring them in to lead that breathwork ceremony. And that will be on July 12th as the third week of the program. And we also have a money-back guarantee. And the money-back guarantee comes with an asterisk. It essentially says, we recognize that microdosing is illegal. And we as an organization at the Third Wave cannot explicitly provide you with illegal substances because we need to stay on the right side of the law, obviously. So with that being said, if you enroll in our program and you cannot find the substances to microdose with by July 12th, which is basically the day, the week that we will start microdosing, then we will give you a refund on your program. So that means if you were to purchase the program today, you have a full month to figure that out. And just as a little bit of a hint, in our microdosing course, which you will get access to as part of your purchase, we have details on if you're going to source yourself, what are some best ideas or ways that have worked for other people in the past. So while we can provide some limited guidance, we cannot explicitly help you with sourcing substances. And that's at a $497 price point. This is quite low for all the value that's being provided. The next time we offer this, which will be likely in mid to late August, early September, that price will significantly increase. But we want to make sure that, especially because of COVID and all the economic uncertainty that is going on right now, that this is accessible to everyone, because the quality and the diversity of the group will be critical to the success of what we are creating together. So Matt, if you could please make that available for people. So that is now available on Webinar Jam. The link is now live. If you guys, whoever is watching, if you could just click through and let us know and confirm that that link is working. And Matt, if you could just confirm that they say that yes, it is working. If you can just click through there and double check that that link is working.
No one's commenting yet.
It takes a little bit.
Okay, working.
It's working. Okay, perfect. So registration for that closes on June 21st. That's a week from today. Like I said, it's limited to 50 participants. And this will be going out to 30,000 people on the email list and 80,000 people on our social media following. If you enroll today, you get access to the course materials immediately. And I will be available for an IG Live both this week and next week for those first course participants who enroll early. If you have any questions, now is a great time because we're about to get in the Q&A. So any questions about the Microdosing Experience program, please provide them or put them in the Webinar Jam. And then let's go to the final slide. We'll go to the Q&A now, and then let's go to the final slide. And these are just a few details for the screen so that you just have all of those in front of you. Again, registration ends June 21st at midnight. Class starts June 28th, and classes will be held at both 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for 6 straight Sundays. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and let's now get into our Q&A. Can you see the questions that are marked? You should be able to see what's marked as questions.
Here's an interesting one. What are the effects of 5-HTP and microdosing?
I don't know.
Okay, pass on that one. Will microdosing build a tolerance if I want to macrodose?
Great question. So will microdosing build a tolerance if I want to macrodose? So what we generally advise is if you are planning to do a macrodose session, so if you have a ceremony coming up, then to stop microdosing for the week beforehand as a way to give yourself some space and distance as part of that process of simplifying and letting go of other distractions. So microdosing can build a tolerance, but as long as you give yourself a full week beforehand, it should be okay when you go into the high dose experience.
Question here about the course. How much psilocybin, for example, should they have on hand for the 6-week course?
So for the 6-week course, how much psilocybin should you have on hand? Let's say if you're microdosing 0.25 grams 3 times per week, you need to do that 18 times. 18 times 0.25 is about 4.5 grams of psilocybin. So in total for the course, it would probably make sense to have a total of 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms to help guide you through the entirety of the process.
Is it okay to microdose every day or to have days in between? How long do you suggest?
So there are a couple different protocols that are common with microdosing. One is the Fadiman protocol, which says microdose day 1, take day 2, day 3 off, and microdose on day 4. The other protocol comes from Paul Stamets, who is more a mycologist extraordinaire and interested in the benefits of neuroplasticity. And he says microdose 4 straight days, then take 3 days off. My personal protocol is to microdose every other day. Microdose day 1, take day 2 off, microdose day 3, take day 4 off, microdose day 5, and take day 6 off. This is because psychedelics have short-term tolerance. So if you microdose 2 days in a row, it will be less noticeable on the second day. And at the same time, I think there are significant benefits from microdosing 3 to 4 times a week. We didn't get deep into that in the particulars, but essentially it can help with reducing gut inflammation because it is a serotonin agonist. And so we know that psychedelics are anti-inflammatory, and we know that reducing inflammation in the gut and in the brain significantly helps us to spend more time in a parasympathetic state.
Craig asks, I've never done mushrooms before. Should I start with microdosing or have a full-out guided experience?
There are a few factors that's dependent on. One, if you have a clinical condition or you're on pharmaceutical medication, then the first step is to wean yourself off of that pharmaceutical medication. If you're clean and you're not on any other medications at this point in time, then that just depends on your personal preference. If you can find a guide or a sitter or a therapist who you trust and you know well, then a high dose, mid to high dose experience should be done first. If you don't have a really trusted guide or sitter in your network or community, then starting with microdosing first as a way to calibrate your relationship with that medicine is a better way to start. So if you have someone who you really trust to do a high dose, start there. If you don't, and you're on your own for the most part, then start with microdosing and slowly titrate up to establish a relationship with the medicine.
Kathy is on antidepressants, anti-anxiety, and hormones. And she's wondering, can she do microdosing while continuing these medications?
I'm not a medical professional, so what I would encourage you to do is to reach out to a medical professional for that question. If you go to our podcast, we've interviewed several medical doctors on our podcast, and there's also a website called psychedelic.support. Matt, if you could put that hyperlink in, psychedelic.support, where there's a listing of psychiatrists who have some level of expertise in psychedelic medicine.
How long after a high dose should I start microdosing?
Again, this depends a lot on personal preference, but the way that I've usually taught the role of microdosing for integration is immediately after. Because when we have that high dose ceremony, we again puncture that sympathetic state, allowing us to have the 50,000 foot perspective immediately after, for the 2 to 3 to 4 weeks after a high dose experience. We're more malleable and adaptable and easier to change. So if we also microdose as part of that experience, it will essentially elongate the afterglow effect of the high dose to make it easier to integrate new ways of being into our everyday routine.
Go ahead and repeat the question you answered.
And the question was, should we immediately start microdosing after a high dose experience, or do we want to wait a little bit? And my guidance is to start microdosing immediately after a high dose experience. And in fact, this is what we will do in the microdosing experience program. Is we will have a breathwork ceremony, which will act as the breakthrough ceremony. And then we will do 4 weeks of microdosing after that for the integration process.
What's the difference between microdosing with
So what's the difference between microdosing with LSD and psilocybin? When we microdose with LSD, it tends to be a bit more stimulating. It's more dopaminergic. There tends to be more of a psychedelic coffee-like effect. A lot of people find that it helps with cognition and creativity. Whereas with microdosing with mushrooms, it tends to be more grounding, more, for the emotional body. It's only 6 hours instead of 12 hours. And generally what we say is if you struggle with anxiety or insomnia, to avoid microdosing LSD and to instead look at how you can microdose with mushrooms. By the way, Matt, if there are questions related to the program, can you specifically address that?
Sure. The question, is this program online?
So the program that we're offering is completely online. It's completely virtual. We will do the 6 group coaching sessions over Zoom. There will be a Slack community support, Slack and Telegram. We'll have 2 different groups. So Slack is more for the public, everyday thing. Telegram will be more private because it's encrypted and things like that. So we'll have those 2 support groups, and everything will be online for the program.
What is a good dose to start with for depression?
Again, so we have another question. What is a good dose to start with when it comes to depression? That depends on a couple things. It depends if you're currently on antidepressants or not. If you are on antidepressants, again, we first encourage you to talk to a medical professional before going through with microdosing your higher doses of psychedelics.
Let's see. Do you suggest combining microdosing with other adaptogens such as turmeric?
So the question is, do I suggest combining microdosing with other adaptogens, things like turmeric, rhodiola, ashwagandha? Yes. Again, see microdosing as sort of the cherry on top. But generally, if we can combine microdosing with other wellness modalities and other healing modalities like meditation or adaptogens or probiotics or a ketogenic diet or intermittent fasting or functional fitness, whatever it is, those are all great things to combine. And there's likely, again, this is just hypothesis, so to say, there's likely synergistic effects with psilocybin mushrooms or plant medicines and adaptogens. And I've noticed that when I've taken, for example, psilocybin mushrooms with ashwagandha, that it's really, really helped with mood regulation and staying balanced.
What does the breakthrough ceremony consist of?
So the breakthrough ceremony as part of the Microdosing Experience program will be breath work that is led virtually. There will be sound, so sort of tribal, trance-like sounds that will bring you into a deep state. And then we'll have a guide who will lead you through a breathwork experience from the comfort of your own home. As we've said before, we cannot explicitly provide you with psychedelic substances, but if you choose to take a low to mid to moderate dose of psychedelics while going through the breathwork, that will be up to your own disclosure. And the focus of the breathwork is to help you totally unplug from the matrix, if you will, to be able to take a step back and have that big 50,000-foot view. And, I did this ceremony in January before COVID. Sonic Shamanic rented out this beautiful old church in San Francisco, and they did it for about 100 people. We took CBD and cacao before the experience, and then it lasted for about an hour and a half. And I remember going in, and it was like a total time warp, because when I came out, they were like, "Oh yeah, you were in there for like 2 hours." And I was like, holy shit. So there's more details about Sonic Shamanic and Leo Ratterman on the page for the program. If you want more details, you can get access there. But yeah, that's what it consists of.
People want clarification with the timing. How long is the weekly session?
So each weekly session will be between 60 and 90 minutes, a minimum of 60 minutes for every group coaching call, and a maximum of 90 minutes. The lecture itself will typically be, I would say, anywhere from 45 to 50 minutes. So the content and the teaching and some of that material. And then we'll also leave significant time in each coaching call for questions, to interact with other group members. We'll have breakout rooms so that we can have small group discussions about the various topics that we're going through. It will be such a great chance. I think, to be honest, the best part of this Microdosing Experience program is the community that you'll be able to connect with. There are so many interesting people that are part of Third Wave's community, and this will be the first time that we're actually doing something online to bring all of those people together. And that to me is like the best part of this. It's just being able to connect with entrepreneurs and creatives and founders and just really kind, interesting, unique folks from all over the world. Australia, Europe, North America, you name it, South Africa, India, Japan. We have people from all over the world who are in our community.
Vendesh is wondering, how can he integrate cannabis, or should he integrate cannabis in LSD microdosing?
So there's a question about the interaction between cannabis and LSD microdosing. The first thing that comes up for me is at times if I've done LSD microdosing too much, then I can be somewhat anxious. And LSD microdosing, like I said, is sort of similar to a psychedelic coffee. So cannabis, I would say microdosing cannabis in combination with the LSD microdosing, the microdosing cannabis will help you to stay grounded. So it'll be sort of a nice integration of those two. Beyond that, and again, this is all up to sort of your personal intuition and what works best for you. Just experiment. So if you microdose with LSD 3 times a week and then you want to try some cannabis at the end of the week in addition to that, maybe the microdosing LSD really helps you to focus and get really into something, and then the cannabis helps you to take the full step back to see things from the wider perspective. That might be another way to think about it.
Great. What are some of your favorite books at the moment?
The next question is, what are some of my favorite books at the moment? And this is so good. So another book that I have here, which I just read, is called The Chemical Muse, Drug Use and the Roots of Western Civilization. It's about how the ancient Greeks in particular widely used drugs, not just psychedelics, although that's talked about with Kaikion and the Eleusinian Mysteries, but all other types of drugs as well. This is really, really quite a fascinating book. The other book that I've been getting into, which is actually a series of 2 books, are called The Listening Society and The Nordic Ideology. And that's by a philosopher named Hansi Freinacht, who is this Austrian philosopher who lives in the Swiss mountains. And Hansi writes about a meta-modern society. What does a listening society really look like? And that's why in today's call, I encourage everyone, what does it look like to go inwards and really listen and cultivate stillness? And Listening Society and Nordic Ideology. I think the third one that I'm rereading is Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac. And it's a great reminder of the Beat Generation. It's a great reminder of how Buddhism first came to be integrated into Western culture, somewhat through the use of psychedelics. And that's just, it's a classic. So this one, Drug Use in Western Civilization, The Chemical Muse, The Listening Society, and Nordic Ideology, and then Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac.
Will the sessions be recorded in the experience?
All of the sessions will be recorded. So if you can't, next question, I'm missing my transitions here. The next question was, will the sessions be recorded? Yes. All sessions for the Microdosing Experience program will be recorded. So if you can't make a live one, then you can always watch a recording after the fact. We encourage you as much as possible to come to the live one because that's where a lot of the interaction will be with the other course members. But if you can't make it live, we will have the recording.
Great. Do you think that we can meditate better through microdosing LSD?
In my own personal practice, I've found that microdosing can help with a meditation practice. So the question is, does microdosing help with meditation? Yes, generally. I would say that is true, that microdosing in particular to help kickstart a meditation practice is very useful.
Wow. Do you think it's a good idea to go on a Vipassana meditation with microdosing LSD?
The question is it a good idea to go on a Vipassana meditation with microdosing LSD? My initial instinct says no, because from what I understand with the Goenka tradition, that you're supposed to have no external things. So I think the most important part in doing a Vipassana is to honor the integrity of the ritual and the lineage, and to honor the wishes of the teacher who you are choosing to learn under. And I have a feeling that microdosing LSD would be frowned upon. At the same time, maybe you're a maverick. I'm somewhat of a maverick. That would be something that I may experiment with at some point. So that would be interesting at the very least. And I'd be very curious to know how it goes for you if you choose to do that.
We have questions. Where's the coupon code? So we're going to look into that.
The coupon code. Can you clarify? So when it comes to the coupon code, can we clarify?
Yeah, it should. Where B said there is an early bird $100 off special, but they're not seeing it when they click through. We'll let them know that we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. And if you could email us, if that's you. So if you're interested in the early bird discount special and you want to get more information about that, then just email us contact@thethirdwave.co or paul@thethirdwave.co, and we will get back to you today or tomorrow at the latest.
All right. Great. How does this course compare to the existing online microdosing course?
So the next question is, how does our Microdosing Experience program compare to the existing course itself? The existing course itself right now is a few videos, it's PDFs, it's a tracking spreadsheet, some expert interviews, but there's no guidance, coaching support, accountability, Slack group, et cetera, et cetera. So the big distinction between the course, which you can purchase and download and go through at any time, and the experience program is this 6 live weeks. It comes with a breathwork breakthrough ceremony and specific guidance and curriculum to lead you through that entire process.
Tom gets intestinal cramps while microdosing with mushrooms. What would you advise him to change?
So the question is, what happens if you're getting intestinal cramps while microdosing? There's one of two things that you can do. Stop microdosing and see if the intestinal cramps go away. The other thing to do would be to lower the microdose amount to see if that addresses the issue. And then the third thing would be if you're experiencing intestinal cramps with a certain substance, like psilocybin mushrooms, to try a different substance, either another plant medicine or LSD or maybe even cannabis, to see if that changes the discomfort for you.
All right. Ian wants to know, is there a specific protocol to be followed in the course, or is it up to them if they have some experience?
So the next question is there a specific protocol to follow in the course that we're offering, the Microdosing Experience program? We will talk through that in the actual program itself and basically give you the framework and guide you through the framework about which microdosing protocol will be best for you. And that's because everyone is different. So I don't want to come on here and say, we're going to teach everyone to do this. The whole part of this program is to offer coaching and guidance and feedback so that person A might do it slightly different than person B, who might do it slightly different than person C. And that's a huge part of why we're offering this, is for the personalization and customization of a microdosing protocol for your needs.
Great. And to clarify, there is no coupon code. It's just the early bird special as they see. It was a mistake.
Okay. So to clarify, there is no coupon code. It's just an early bird special for everyone to see.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's see. Can the amount of psilocybin in mushrooms vary between strains and time of year?
Next one. Do the next question.
Let's see. Is this being recorded?
Yep.
And available? Okay.
Oh, this will be recorded. The question is this recorded and available for later? Yes, we recorded all of this. We'll make this available. We will also do our best to put a link up to the slides in the YouTube recording afterwards.
Okay. And do you think psychedelics help with the decalcification of the pineal gland?
I'm not going to answer that.
How does psychedelics change the gut microbiome?
So the question is about what's the relationship between psychedelics and the microbiome. So again, we're in the very early stages of research on this. There's a company based out of the UK called Eleusis, ELEUSIS, that is doing research particularly on the potential of psychedelics, the anti-inflammatory potential of psychedelics. They're looking, from what I understand, more at the brain, but much of it is also going on in the gut. And there's a specific researcher that they're working with. His name is Charles Nichols, and he has published some preliminary research on that relationship. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in the relationships between psychedelics and gut health, to go deeper into Eleusis, the research that they've been up to, with a note, I'll put a caveat on that 90% of serotonin is in the gut, and that the research that Charles Nichols had initially done was with a substance called DOI, which is chemically very similar to mescaline, and that he proved that there was significant anti-inflammatory impact of psychedelics when taken. And so that, especially with all that we're learning about the relationship between the gut and the brain, and inflammation in the gut and inflammation in the brain, I think, you know, the real benefit of microdosing is on inflammation in particular, and how microdosing can help to lower chronic inflammation over the long term, mid to long term.
Stan wants to know, does LSD make you smarter?
You got no.
We're basically out of questions.
Okay. So that's it. I don't think we have any other questions at this point in time. I want to, again, thank you all for attending the webinar today. I think at some point we had almost 500 people in the live webinar. That is so fantastic. Thank you all so much for attending. One more note, Matt, if you could put up that last slide. So again, registration opens today for the Microdosing Experience program. We have only 50 slots available. It closes in 1 week on June 21st, and classes start June 28th. There are only 50 spots available, and we will have a money-back guarantee. So if you can't, then let us know. Again, we thank you so much for joining us for today's class, and we can't wait to see you for the next one. We already sold 20.